utilitarianism here. So this is John Hospers. He was a moral philosopher and political philosopher. He also did some work on aesthetics, so stuff involving value, right? He was also the Libertarian presidential candidate in 1972. And he was a utilitarian. He defended libertarianism as a political philosophy on the basis of utilitarian moral ideas. And he also develops a version of rule utilitarianism. And so he starts by thinking about those cases that we just thought about: the grade change, the plea for leniency to the judge, a DEA sitting on evidence, and the fourth strike, and a few others as well. Right? And so here's an overview of what he does in this article, which is just called Rule Utilitarianism, right? What he says is that we ought to reject act utilitarianism in favor of rule utilitarianism because rule utilitarianism does a better job of explaining what's wrong with those cases than act utilitarianism does, right? So he says in the cases that we've just discussed, it looks like traditional or act utilitarianism implies we ought to change the grade, that the judge should show leniency, that the DA should sit on evidence, that the guy ought to get a fourth strike, and so on, right? But many of us, of course, think, as we just saw, think that something's off with those sorts of responses. And so he says, his response to the student pleading for the grade is, after pondering the matter, I persist in believing that it would not be right to change the grade under these circumstances. But perhaps you agree with my decision, and perhaps you don't. But if you agree that I should not have changed the grade, and if you're also a utilitarian, right, which he actually happens to be, it's just also a hypothetical, right? He says, how are you going to reconcile such a decision with utilitarianism? From the hypothesis, right, the greatest amount of happiness will be brought about by changing the grade. So why shouldn't I change it? This in turn raises an interesting question. If it's wrong for me to do the act publicly, is it any less wrong for me to do it secretly, right? Notice in the grade change, no one will really know except the professor and the student, right? So not many people are affected, right? And again, many of us are likely to think or to feel, at least many people would, that to release the man would be a mistake. The sentence imposed on him by the minimum permitted by the law for his offense, and he should serve out the term in accordance with the law, right? And then we may not be able to articulate why, but we feel strongly that the district attorney should not sit on the evidence, but that he should reveal every scrap of evidence he knows, even though the revelation means releasing the prisoner, and now known to be innocent, to do more crimes and be convicted of them later, right? So what conclusion emerges from that, he asks, from those examples, from those thought experiments about morality and what people tend to think about them, right? He says, if the examples point it all in the right direction, they indicate that there are some acts which is right to perform, even though by themselves they will not have good consequences. Like if I just don't go vote, it won't matter very much, right? So long as everybody else is basically voting, or most people are basically voting. And there are some acts which it is wrong to perform, even though by themselves they would have good consequences, such as sitting on the evidence or changing the grade. But this conclusion is opposed to utilitarianism as we've considered it thus far. So he's introducing then a different type of utilitarianism. Now think of the baseball example, in which there was a wide margin, and far the biggest proportion of the class on any of those questions was that they should not get a fourth strike, right? So he says this example, the baseball player one, though only an analogy, gives us a clue as to the kind of theory we're about to consider. Let's call it rule utilitarianism. So we've got act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. And as the names imply, the way to understand a key difference between them is to think about the role that rules play in moral decision-making according to both ones, right? So that's one thing. And then the consequences of what, right, is another question to worry about. So he says, rule utilitarianism comes to this. Each act in the moral life, like deciding whether to raise the grade, to keep the promise to the murderer at the door, to tell the truth to the Nazis, and so forth, falls under a rule. And we are to judge the rightness or wrongness of the act, not by its consequences, that's act utilitarianism, but by the consequences of its universalization. That is, by the consequences of the adoption of the rule under which it follows, under which the act falls, excuse me. So, and then he mentions this point about Kant. In the next chapter, we'll see that Kant, his moral theory, emphasized this idea of universality and universalizability. There, it's a non-consequentialist version of universalizability. Here we have a different interpretation of what universalizability looks like in a moral theory, and it's the rule utilitarian version. And he says, this conception, the one that's favored by rule utilitarianism, differs from Kant in being concerned with consequences, but it retains the key feature which Kant introduced, that notion of universalizability, right? So he says, to put it in Kantian language, the maximum of the action, if universalized, would have bad consequences. But the individual act of your not voting on any specific occasion, or of any person's not voting as long as others continue to vote, would probably have no bad consequences, right? So the idea here is that rules play a different role. In act utilitarianism, rules are just rules of thumb to allow you shortcuts for having to calculate the utility of every little action that you do. So they're just rules of thumb, right? In rule utilitarianism or restricted utilitarianism, rules are more than rules of thumb. They are hard rules. They are rules that if everybody followed, the universalization of everyone following those rules would have the consequences of maximizing overall utility, right? So he says, it's the consequences of everyone doing that would be bad, right? So think of it this way. If I dump battery acid down the gutter over here, that's probably not that big of a deal. It's not great, obviously, but it's not going to poison, say, the crawfish farms. If everybody dumps battery acid down the gutter, it's probably going to have a negative effect on swamp life, right? And in our water system and so forth, right? So it's because if everyone did that, it would have bad consequences. There are other ways of thinking about what that question means in everyday moral language. Sometimes it might have a Kantian flavor, and we'll come back to that. But certainly one way of thinking about that question that we often hear people discuss in moral conversations when they're considering whether or not to do something is, what if everybody did that, right? What would the consequences of everybody doing that be? If they were bad, then we ought not do it ourselves, right? So he says, thus the district attorney may do more good in a particular case by sitting on the evidence, but even if this case has no consequence for future cases because nobody ever finds out, in other words, it's done in secret, the general policy or practice of doing what this kind of thing is a very bad one. It uproots the basic premise of our legal system, namely that an innocent person should not be condemned. Our persistent conviction, right? So in other words, what he's doing is developing a utilitarianism that fits better with what he thinks are our core moral intuitions, right? So he says there are some kinds of acts which have little or no effect, one person or two or three, like the grade change, but which have very considerable effects if everyone, or even just a large number of them, does those actions, right? So rule utilitarianism is designed to handle those sorts of cases, ones in which act utilitarianism looks like it might require us to do something really, really bad as an obligation to maximize overall happiness. So he says, well, here it is. Here's what you have to do then. In act utilitarianism, you're just thinking about, and we're simplifying it even here, the consequences of me performing that action on that occasion, right? So it's the consequences of the particular act, as the name implies, right? Rule utilitarianism has hard rules, and the trick is identifying which ones, if everyone followed, would maximize overall happiness, right? So first we think about, well, what's the action that I'm performing? Think about the murderer at the door. Sometimes we're usually taught a general rule that turns out not to be a very good one, but we'll start there anyway. Always keep your promises. Well, according to act utilitarianism, that's false. I should break my promises. Maybe that's a bad rule, is my point here, right? But clearly what act utilitarianism says is, look, keeping that rule is bad. I've got to think about the actions of the concrete action itself rather than the consequences of some rule. So I break that rule to maximize overall happiness. The rule utilitarian wants to say, well, first, that's not a very good rule, granted, right? And to write sophisticated rules like always keep your promises, except when doing so will produce more harm than overall good, right? So we have now a more sophisticated rule. If everyone follows that rule and it maximizes overall, and it would maximize happiness based on the foreseeable consequences of everyone following that policy, then we should, as opposed to some alternative rule, then that's the right moral rule for me to always act on. So we get a difference in the role that rules play and a difference in what consequences we're looking at. The consequences of rule following, universalized, or the consequences of a particular action in a particular set of circumstances.